Theology. I'd like to thank you all for coming. Dr. Bingemer, our guest, came this morning from Chicago and saw the lingering of lake effects, but she's brought with her with this thought what I like to call the Copacabana effect.
Only Copacabana could come to.
Dr. Maria Clara Bingemer is an associate professor of theology at the Pontifical Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro, and currently a senior research fellow at the Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology at DePaul University. She's formerly dean of its Center for Theology and Human Sciences and now serves also in an administrative capacity in that same center. She served on many different advisory boards, many different journals, including the Advisory Council of the Fetzer Institute in Kalamazoo, Michigan. From 2009 to 2011, she was a member of Caritas International's Theological Commission. She served 4 years as a member of the Journal of the American Academy of Religion and is former director of the Loyola Center for Faith and Culture in Rio. She holds a master's degree in theology from the Pontifical Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro, a PhD in systematic theology from the Gregorian University in Rome, and has done postdoctoral work in Leuven. She's on many editorial boards, and just to give you a sense of the range, including Communio in Lisbon and Concilium. She's widely published in many languages. One of her most recent contributions is to a book on Pope Francis, Renewal and Hope, that was published by Paulinus in Brazil in 2013, and was also the topic of a lecture she gave just a few weeks ago at DePaul University in Chicago. On the 25th of this month, she will lecture at the center in Chicago on mysticism, witnessing, and community, comparing the martyr communities of Tiburon and San Salvador. Her publication list is very lengthy. She's worked on an early book on eschatology with the recently deceased Father Livano. She's written on Virgin Mary, women's experience of God, spirituality of liberation, and of course her beloved Simone Weil. I brought with me today one of her latest publications, which will appear in English translation as The Mystery in the World, Passion for God in Times of Disbelief, scheduled to come out in 2015. I've also had the privilege of working with Maria Clara on the basis of a conference we did in November 2012, Witnessing, Prophecy, Politics, and Wisdom, and this will come out with Orbis, hopefully in the coming year. Will include essays by John Sobrino, Carlos Canone, Matt Ashley, Todd Prevost, Michael Lee, and many other local favorites, as well as scholars from Brazil and the Philippines. Please join me in welcoming Maria Clara Bingemer, who's going to lecture on the mystic of the Holocaust, the journey of Etty Hillesum from Eros to Agape.
To thank with all my heart my colleague and friend and collaborator, because we have an agreement of collaboration that we started while Peter was the director of the Center for World Catholicism with the book Rio. In the middle of the way, he changed to Notre Dame. But the agreement with the Pope continues. That's why I am there for another period of research. And it is great joy to be able to come here for the second time. I came already once to speak about Dorothy Day and Simone Weil. And now I thought Etty Hillesum would be a good topic, mostly after discovering two things about her. Because, well, speaking about Etty Hillesum, who lived 29 years, who left diaries and letters, we think that perhaps she's very unknown, but Pope Benedict XVI, after resigning, one of his last homilies, on Ash Wednesday, if I'm not wrong, speaking about conversion, he mentioned two examples, Dorothy Day and Etty Hillesum. And now studying the community of the monks of Tiburon, I discovered that one of the third books of the prior Christian de Chergé was the diaries of Etty Hillesum. He made the monks read, etc. It's very extraordinary. This young woman who lived not long, but who live very intensively and have a beautiful legacy. So I'm happy that Peter accepted my suggestion that the topic of the lecture would be on her. And the title we gave, it's The Journey of Etty Hillesum from Eros to Agape. I will make an introduction, trying to situate the topic. Departing from the encyclical, the first encyclical of Benedict XVI, Deus Caritas Est. After, I will develop a short biography of Etty Hillesum to make her more known to those who don't know her. And then I will pick up some theological reflections on that. I think it's her journey from Eros to Agape. For me, English is not my mother tongue, and it's easier to read, so I'll try to read in a non-boring way. If it's very boring, afterwards we can dialogue and perhaps it's more dynamic. Perhaps one of the most burning and instigating questions of Christianity is, I don't know if this is on. Oh, yes, yeah. The most burning and instigating questions of Christianity is the one on the reconciliation between spirit and body. In spite of all the efforts Christian theology and moral did after Vatican II, we still can perceive a duality, not so healthy, between spirit and body, which is not biblical at all. And the celebration of love, which doesn't put in value the erotic, putting it into suspicion as it was evil or demonic. In this sense, the encyclical Deus Caritas Est helps a lot because it states that love between man and woman, which is neither planned nor willed, but somehow imposes itself upon human beings, was called eros by the ancient Greeks. Let us note straight away that the Greek Old Testament uses the word eros only twice, while the New Testament does not use it at all. Of the three Greek words for love, eros, philia, the love of friendship, and agape, New Testament writers prefer the last, which occurs rather infrequently in Greek usage. To hear Deus Caritas Est. Nevertheless, even criticizing and overcoming it, Christianity didn't eliminate eros from its horizon, as the same Benedict XVI affirms in his encyclical. I quote again, number 4, the Greeks, not unlike other cultures, consider eros principally as a kind of intoxication, the overpowering of reason by a divine madness, which tears man away from his finite existence and enables him, in the very process of being overwhelmed by divine power, to experience supreme happiness. All other powers in heaven and on earth thus appear secondary. Omnia vincit amor, says Virgil in the Bucolics. Love conquers all. And he adds, et nos cedamus amori. Let us do yield to love. In the religions, this attitude found expression in fertility cults, part of which was the sacred prostitution which flourished in many temples. Eros was thus celebrated as divine power, as fellowship with the divine. End of quote. The Pope will say, nevertheless, that the novelty of Jesus Christ's gospel will be in go beyond Eros, finding the agapic synthesis made not only of sexual attraction and physical exaltation, but also of affection, care, zeal with the loving one, up to sacrifice and self-offering. The seal of God in the love we experience in history must have these characteristics of donation and surrendering, to the risk of not being able of auto-understanding as really defined and revealed. In this reflection, so we want to bring the life experience of a contemporary mystic, a young Dutch woman named Etty Hillesum, always called by her nickname, Etty. In spite of not being attached to any religious practice, not even this Jewish one by belonging, She has experienced an uncommonly deep intimacy with the mystery of God. Etty was killed in Auschwitz at 29 years old. And she reveals in her writings and in her mystical experience an also uncommon integration between Eros and Agape. She was a woman very aware of her sexed corporeity, living it fully. That is why we think she can add and enlighten our understanding of this anthropological integration proposed by Deus Caritas Est, which is today one of the most urgent interrogations that Christian theology and pastoral are called to administer and propose to contemporary world. Etty Hillesum, the girl who learned how to kneel down. When we tell Etty Hillesum's surprising biography, we have to take care in front of the existing tendencies to make her similar to Edith Stein, or seeing her as an adult and frank. And we should be very cautious against the Christian appropriation of her person and her life. Etty Hillesum lived and died a Jew, in spite of not being a religious practicing Jew in her young years, but lived and died as a Jew. She was a Jewess who had a deep encounter with God, and from then on, she chose her own path. However, it is undeniable that among her readings were very often the New Testament, very especially the Gospel, and St. Augustine, mostly the Confessions. Like so many other European Jews of the first quarter of 20th century, Etty was born in a country configured by Christian culture. At January 15, 1914, in Middelburg, Holland. Her father was professor of classic idioms, and her mother a Russian Jewess. Yes, Etty was the eldest of the 3 children. Etty left her father's school in 1932, when she went to Amsterdam to do her university studies in law, and afterwards in psychology. She lived at Han Wegerif House. This man was a 62-year-old widower with whom she developed an intimate relationship. She made her living as a housekeeper and also teaching languages. She taught Russian, her mother's idiom. Her diaries, which begin at the time she was 27 years old, tell all the things that happened in Han Wegerif's house and the conversations of the group who got frequently together there. Those conversations are mainly about the progression of the restrictions of which the Jews were victims, which were turning more and more strict, and they were part of the extermination project of Nazism, the final solution that happened at that historical moment. Like many others, Etty doesn't realize what is happening on the beginning, but afterwards she begins to be more and more aware of it. She reports also in the diaries her conflictive feelings about her relationship with Mr. Wegerif, whom she calls and refers to as Papa Han, and from whom she gets pregnant and makes an abortion. But much more important, however, than Han Wegerif was her encounter with Julius Peer, called S in her diaries, a disciple of Carl Gustav Jung, well known as having been the founder of psychochirology. It is the study and classification of palm print hands. He had a highly charismatic, almost magic personality. He provoked an incredible fascination on women. Etty felt absolutely seduced by this man and became his assistant, intellectual partner, and lover. Her passionate love for S, who was a believer, a Jewish believer, helped her to develop an enormous religious sensitivity, which gave her writings an omnipresent mystical character. S was the one who taught her to pronounce God's name without constraint, and it was also he who invited her to undertake her journey, the journey till the deepest bottom, the deepest background of human intimacy and loneliness, within which God's presence is awakened and emerged to the conscience. Etty went her way towards an always more consistent and intense conversation with this God discovered within a great human love. And as she surrendered more frequently and profoundly to prayer, she began to feel graced with very strong mystical experiences. Everything was interrupted, however, when persecution to the Jews began to arrive at the maximum level, and she assumed the task of dactylographer to the Jewish Council, which had to do the mediation between Nazis and Jews. Established by the Nazis, the council was formed with the illusion from the persecuted Jews that through that mediation and negotiation, there was the possibility of saving some Jews of the worst of destinies. Nevertheless, immediately it turned to be an arm in the Nazis' hand. After only 2 weeks at the council, Etty decided to go voluntarily to Westerbork camp as social assistant. This was a cruel interruption of her life. She was aware of it and chose it freely, even having the opportunity of not going and escape if she wanted so. Her diaries indicate she was convinced of being faithful to herself only if she didn't abandon those who were in danger, her suffering people, and if she used her energy to bring life to the lives of others, to be a balsam to their wounds, in her own words. Short-term events would show that she wouldn't be exempted of her people's destiny, the people to whom she belonged. She arrived at the Westerbork exactly at the moment when the deportation to Auschwitz were beginning. To more than 100,000 Jewish, Westerbork was the final station before Auschwitz-Birkenau, the terrible extermination camp situated in Poland. Between August 42 and September 43, Etty Hillesum, who was 20 years old, employed her time writing her diary, letters, and taking care of the sick in the camp's hospital. During this period, she traveled with official permission to Amsterdam approximately a dozen times, delivering letters assuring the provision of medicines to the sick in the camp and bringing back messages. But most of the time she was in the city. She was obliged to be in bed because of weakness and sickness. Her very frail health resented visibly of the restriction food regime, the forbiddance to use public transportation, and have to do large foot walking to move from one place to the other. The last part of her diary was written in Amsterdam after her first month in Westerbork and reports the sudden illness and death of Julius Beer. Etty is able to be with him at his last moments. The shock of the death of the one she loved so much is lived by her with serenity and as part of the pains of that moment. She came back to Westerbork after that, but had to come back to Amsterdam again to go to a hospital. Finally, at the beginning of June 1943, she left Amsterdam, going to Westerbork for the last time. The next station would be Auschwitz and the gas chamber. Many details of Etty's personality are fascinating. A young, beautiful, and refined woman, she exerted great attraction on men, having had, even so young, a lot of admirers and boyfriends. Extremely brilliant intellectually and cultivated, dominating a lot of languages, Dutch, German, French, English, and Russian. She knew deeply German and Russian literature, being a fine specialist in many important authors like Hölderlin, Rilke, or Dostoevsky. Refined in her taste, she was also open to others, with an extreme gift to make friends. She dreamed to be a writer and travel the world learning other idioms and relating to other cultures. We can notice in her diaries a concern with the perfectioning of the style of her own writing, which will attain a level of growth worthy of note at her final days. However, it is her soul's nobility and her profound and luminous experience of God what calls more our attention here. Facing the certainty of the final interruption of her life at her young 29 years of age, situation which could provoke in anyone a great terror, Etty had an attitude full of heroism and generosity. She faced with extreme courage her deportation to Auschwitz, the same as her extermination, known in advance in the hands of the Nazis, with serene acceptance. She burned with the desire of giving herself, of offering herself to others, of surrendering her life in order those who suffered so much around her could be nourished. On November 30, 1943, the balsam of Etty Hillesum's life was poured in the gas chamber of Auschwitz in solidarity with her own people and millions of human beings. The wild mysticism, hardly definable mysticism of Etty Hillesum has some extremely remarkable points which deserve to be put in value and comment for being inescapable testimony of the Spirit's freedom, who blows wherever and whatever wants. The first, the integration between Eros and Agape. I said already that Etty was very beautiful, very sexy, someone very aware of her body and aware of her sexual hungers and thirsts. Very feminine. She was at the same time extremely independent and free in her choices and elections. The relationships, multiple and diverse, with people of the other sex, in which she entered, she lived them deeply, even when it resulted in continuous conflict, as it had been with an older man widower as handvegative, or when it resulted in an overabundance of intensity and passion, as it was the case with Julius Speer. About Speer, we can see through Etty's diaries that she experienced all the range of feelings which move interiorly a passionate woman who can't be secure about the man she loves: jealousy, possessiveness, flame. But that doesn't mean that this enormous and intense capacity of love remained only at the erotic level. The somehow uncontrolled and possessive libido of her young years weren't but the immense force of an inextinguishable desire, a call of life to self-giving. However, this desire of sharing, all this love of which she felt filled of, she will realize it, but not exactly, through a stable union, a marriage, and motherhood. We can observe through her diaries, reading, how this woman, pretty, intelligent, young and brilliant, was capable of making the passage from immediate life pleasures to the hardest sacrifice out of love and solidarity. And do this with joy, gratitude, peace, and the profound and spiritual conscience without any bitterness. On the contrary, she was capable of seeing beauty in the mortal desolation of the concentration camp, going to Auschwitz singing with her family, and appreciating within the horror of the final solution, of which she was the victim, the beautiful elements of nature, the water that flows, the smell of the flowers, etc. And to feel rich and graced, even being obliged to face and bear a certain and unjust death. Speer was undoubtedly the one who served as a catalyst of this radical spiritual liberation among the painful restrictions she was obliged to live. He was simultaneously her lover and mystagogue, once he opened that woman's heart to the relationship with God. And God will be, at last, at the end, her only interlocutor. Through him, she could see how suffering, when accepted, doesn't diminish but strengthens life at a quality level. Love between them was at the same time erotic and contemplative. Speer guided her in the search for the essential, enhanced by the urgency brought by the cruel destiny reserved to Jews. It was him who taught her to speak about God unshamedly and to speak to God uninterruptedly. Thus, we can notice in the process reported by Etty in her diary and letters, while exteriority around her became more narrow, restrictions, rationings, imprisonments, deportations, sufferings of all kinds, her interiority went on enlarging and widening to an infinite level through prayer, discipline, ascetics, self-knowledge, and always greater love for others and for God. It was also Speer who showed Etty the terrain where the real battle of life takes place. In front of the certainty that what the Nazis wanted was the total destruction of the Jewish, Etty saw that the demons who dwell at people's interior were real forces against which it is necessary to struggle. In the moment of Speer's death, Etty's mystic had acquired already its full form. It emerged, not denying reality and historical facts, but entering and penetrating the heights and lows of reality and transforming both. We think that the high point of Etty Hillesum's spiritual itinerary happens at April 30th, 1942, when she takes the decision of marrying Speer in order to, if he is deported, be able to travel with him. It is when she tells herself about the risks of such an adventure and writes in the diary, I quote, "Yes, I know, one finds oneself simply with a destiny instead of a life," end of quote. In these pages that close the notebook number 6 of her diary, Etty feels herself mature to assume a destiny. And this means to get out of the security of the house of Hamvegerif and his protection, and assume an uprooted life, cut off either of a past as of a future. With very feminine words, Etty compares this process and its end with a pregnancy. I quote, "Something in me came to turn. It was there, and I hadn't anything else to do but grasp it. Suddenly, I knew I was going to tie my life to his, in a platonic marriage, to be able to be close to him. And after that, I will hand him over, safe and sound, to the Freundin. The Freundin is Hertha Levy, the woman with whom Speer had promised to get married, and who lived in the free zone of London." Etty, the idea of Etty was travel with him, arrive to London, and make the encounter possible between Speer and Hertha Levy. Etty desires the radicalism of communion born out of love, and this communion implies to share the anguish and pain of the man she loved, even knowing that he would not marry her, and even sacrificing her personal happiness and her future. Speer will die before Etty can do this trip with him in this getaway that would free him. The destiny to which God had matured at Hillesum's heart of flesh, however, was bigger than Speer, and through him reached the whole people of Israel. Etty lived Speer's death with acceptance. Death was for her the great mystery of life, to be received and even revered. She writes, and I quote, "To look death in the face and accept this death, this annihilation, as constitutive part of life, and expand this life. On the contrary, to sacrifice since now the death to a bit of this life, fearing death, refusing to accept, it is the best means to the majority of people, because we are afraid when we don't accept keeping only a little bit of life maimed that almost doesn't deserve the name of life. This can seem paradoxical. Excluding death from one's life, one deprives oneself of a complete life, and receiving it, one enlarges and enriches one's own life." End of quote. In her love for Speer, Eros didn't have exclusivity, but it turned out to be an inclusive love, without ceasing of being particular and singular, of a woman who loved a man in all the fullness this feeling meant. After his death, she writes on him, I quote, "He was the mediator between God and me, and now you, the mediator, are gone, and my path takes me directly to God, and I will have to be the mediator for whatever soul I can reach." End of quote. A destiny for which Etty feels mature will be understood afterwards as a mass destiny, and it is necessary to carry its weight. This destiny was her people's destiny, with which she will be in communion without reservations, seeing clearly that there was no more place to think about her own individuality when a whole people, her people, was massacred. And she writes, I quote, "To eliminate all the personal futilities, each one still wants to be saved, knowing very well that if he or she doesn't depart, it will be another one who will replace him or her. Is it important that it is me or that it is another one, this one or that one? This turned to be a mass destiny, and we have to know that. Very hard that. But I always re-encounter myself in prayer. And to pray, I will always be able to do, even at the most meager place. And the little fragment of the mass destiny I charge with, I fix it on my back like a backpack, with always stronger and tight knots. I make one body with it and carry it already through the streets." End of quote. Etty's love is transfigured in pure agape, gracious and generous offer. And it will be this love, born from her mystic experience, from her relationship with God, that she will pour out the deported from Westerbork and Auschwitz till her death. Etty felt that while she walked towards a hard and painful destiny, her interior life flourished and growed as she never dreamed it could happen. On October 1942, she wrote that the soul has a different age from the one registered and written at the registration of births and deaths. It's very interesting, this part. She writes, and I quote, "One can be born with a 1,000-year-old soul," end of quote. Speer himself will tell her, when they talked about the difference of age between both 28 and 55 years old. And he told her, "But what if your soul is older than mine?" End of quote. Besides that, she also felt as belonging to a large spiritual tradition. She had in herself the feeling of being one of the multiple inheritance of a great spiritual heritage, and promised to God and to herself to be the faithful guardian of this, and also to share it as far as I am capable of it, she said. On July 1942, she writes, quote, "In my most intimate daily actions and sensations, it glides a suspicion of eternity. I'm not the only one to be tired, sick, sad, or anguished. I am united with millions of others through the centuries. All this is life, and therefore life is beautiful and full of sense." End of quote. The dichotomy interior world, exterior world seems totally strange and distant to this woman, who knows the reality where she lives, and most of all, the one that expects her, and that she takes on her shoulders with love and full joy. Quote, "Yes, we carry everything inside us, God and heaven, hell and earth, life and death, and totality of history." She reads Augustine and is passionate by the Book of Confessions. And she adds, "Truly, the only love letters we should write should be those addressed to God." Since she relearns prayer to address directly to God, to tell him what is happening inside her, Etty Hillesum feels inside a deep attraction for a deeper prayer life, up to the point that in various moments through the day, to feel inside herself the burning and almost uncontrollable desire to retreat in her room and be alone with God. To a friend who tells her not being able to live alone without a husband and children, she says, I quote, "Not me. I could very well live like that. I could perhaps bear a long time in a bare cell, knelt down for hours on the hard floor, and still there would be inside myself a great and flourishing life, all possible forms of life. I would have them inside myself." End of quote. Her experience of God is completely free, being difficult to identify institutionally or traditionally. In fact, the tradition of which Etty is heiress is the mystical tradition that is born from the spirit freedom. It belongs to the whole humankind, since it auto-discovers itself finite but inhabited by the infinite. The words with which she describes progressively the experience of God's presence in her are very impressive. I quote, "Sometimes, unexpectedly, someone kneels down in a corner of myself. I can be strolling in the street or in the middle of a talk with a person, and this someone who kneels down is I." End of quote. In Westerbork, Etty turned out to be the thinking heart of the whole concentration camp. Her soul, aged of more than 1,000 years and heiress of a long and precious spiritual tradition, found its highest expressions there. Devoted without reserves at the service of her people, her desire grows unceasingly. And she expresses, that impresses me a lot, and she expresses it in terms that make us remind Santa Teresa of Lisieux, for instance. It is not enough for her Westerbork, the microcosm since where her compassive heart and her desire of donation reach the limits of the universe. On October 2nd, she writes, I quote, "I would like to be in all the camps through Europe. I would like to be in the whole front. I don't want to be in security, as they say. I want to be with all this. I want to be in each place a little bit of fraternization with those we call enemies. I want to understand everything that happens. I would like that all those that I can reach, and I know they are many, but give me health, O God, understand the world events on my way. That reminds me a lot of this prayer Santa Teresa of Lisieux writes when she discovered that always she wanted everything. She wanted the contemplative vocation, she wanted the missionary vocation, she wanted the martyrdom vocation, and finally she discovered she will be love in the center of the church, etc. Well, a very Catholic saint and a mystic from Jewish belonging, but not tied to any institution, experienced the same totalizing and openness that the mystical experience brings. Spiritually free as always, she won't hesitate in using terms more than Christian, Eucharistic, to express her desires at the end of her last diary, October 12, 1942. I quote, "I broke my body as bread and distributed it, and why not? They were hungry and missed that for so long." End of quote. And she finishes her diary with the words, "I would like to be a balsam versed on so much wounds." About this Eucharistic feeling of breaking the body as bread, Simone Weil, our common friend, has a prayer that she writes when she is in England, already close to her death, and not allowed to enter occupied France. She writes a prayer to the Father, which has a lot of similarities to it, to want to be given as bread to feed those who are hungry. From then on, she will only write some letters to her friends who stayed behind and will devote herself fully to verse that love that fulfills her heart over all of those who are suffering in the camp. And after that, in the transportation to Auschwitz and in the same extermination camp. Etty Hillesum refused to be stuck at the letdown and despair relating to her and the others. She cuts illusions by the root and sees directly through self-delusion with which the Nazis were blinded by the foolishness of the dictator and the mad system. They are the ones who are prisoners by the wiring, not their prisoners. And in this circumstance so painful and negative, she sees lucidly the fact that without the possibility of the slightest doubt, the Germans did plan the systematic extermination of her people. But she sustains that, and I quote, "If we could find only one decent German, it would be enough reason not to hate the totality of the people. In spite of all suffering and injustice, I can't hate others." End of quote. Etty poured her own life in service for others and in the wish of dying in solidarity with the victims. It is not God that she blames for the disintegration and destruction of her people, but human beings. Looking face to face this reality and knowing what expected her and her family, she insists untiringly that sense and beauty could still be found in the worst of all situations. She feels above all united and sharing the suffering reserved to her people on that historical moment, and from which she wants not to be exempted. To her diary she confides her feelings, and yet 1 year before leaving to Auschwitz she says, and I quote, "When walking, I thought in the day that all this will be over, when we will walk to enter a common room of a camp, where we'll die together with many others. I knew all that while I was walking, and it will be not only my destiny, but the destiny of all, and I accepted it." End of quote. Suffering is central in Etty's vision about human being, and this suffering she learned to embrace when she embraced Spear. Through suffering, we have to share our love with the whole of creation. She says suffering is an art. You can suffer with dignity, but the suffering as death is part of life. End of quote. During her life, Etty learned that art of suffering, which engenders compassion and let it grow from a weak but thinking heart in front of the enormity of her people's suffering. Under the light of mud and the deportations from Westerbork to Auschwitz, she writes, I quote, "I am in a state of mournful contentment." End of quote. There is place for all in a life, to believe in God and a miserable end. It is the question of living life minute per minute and taking suffering as part of the game. And, struggling not to escape reality, she asks God emotionally, I quote, "There is one lesson lacking to learn the hardest, my God, to assume the sufferings you send me and not those I chose for me." End of quote. Etty Hillesum saw her own soul like a quarrel within which the great dramas of history happened. I quote, "I feel myself as a small battlefield where some problems of our time are being disputed. Everything we can expect is to remain humbly available to allow oneself to be that battlefield." End of quote. Her dignity in front of suffering to come is expressed in noble and impressive words. For sure, it is total extermination, but that we may suffer it with grace. Within a terrible suffering, hers and others she knows and of which she takes notice every day and every moment, she feels herself deeply loved. There are two focal points that help us to understand Etty's relationship with God: the compulsion to kneel down and the content of her most intriguing prayers. She herself says that her history is the history of a girl who was learning how to kneel down, learning how to pray. Much more important than her readings from Matthew's Gospel to St. Augustine or Rilke, to have to kneel down to learn how to pray, which is not at all a familiar position for prayer in Jewish tradition, puts in value the nature of her relationship with God. Her diary relates one another time many occasions of her gradual adoption of the knelt position for prayer, in the bathroom, on a choir carpet, in the corner of the room, close to the window, walking down the street, among others. She suggests that the act of kneeling down is more intimate than the intimacies of her sexual life. And this position is the sign of her surrender, her consent to the mystery which goes on taking hold of her irresistibly. It is also very important her growing awareness to be able to pray wherever, behind the wire or in a room in Amsterdam. As long as she grows in the consciousness of her ability to pray wherever and always, she writes about her desire of kneeling down interiorly, a kind of interior position which assumes regularly and with growing frequency. She kneels down in the front of God, who is the Holy. It is an interior prostration without words of images in the depths of her soul in front of the only one who there has to be discerned, thanked, and praised. Etty's body, so sensitive and open to catch everything, feels this desire for kneeling down as a true and totalizing reconfiguration of her whole being, as she describes at April 3rd, 1942, I quote, "My whole body is sometimes crossed by the natural movement of wishing to kneel down, or better, no, it is different. I would say that this gesture of kneeling down is modeled in all my body. I feel it sometimes in my whole body. It turned out to be an infused gesture in my body and that desires to be realized." End of quote. This gesture will be her great consolation during the difficult days she knows she has to face. And when she writes on October 10th of the same year, I quote, "When the storm is too violent, when I don't really know what to do, there are always and yet both hands to unite and both knees to bend. It is a gesture that was not transmitted to us from generation to generation, to us Jews. I had great difficulty to learn it. It is the most precious heritage left to me by the man I almost forgot the name, but whose best part continues to live in me." This God, in front of whom Etty Hillesum kneels down, is not the God of conventional theology. In some of her most inspired and inspiring prayers, Etty promises to take care of God, to keep a place inside her where God can dwell. God is seen as the one who can't do anything about circumstances and sufferings she lives, or about the Jewish destiny. God can't help her, then she will help God. I quote, "I simply have to try to help the best I can. And if I manage to do that, then I will be useful for others too." End of quote. She sees that God is not responsible in front of us for historical events. We are responsible before God for the way by which we bring the divine gift and his presence within it. Etty lived with an undeniable sense God's closeness, the great and unique holy, present in the heart of the whole creation, active in history. And this one has to be protected and cared at the deep of the soul, because he's frail and doesn't smash anyone with his omnipotence. Etty's most significant theological insight, I would say, belongs to the vulnerability of divine life. And we see that after Auschwitz, theology, brilliant theologians took that point on. Altman, Junger, many. The vulnerability of divine life. And however, this weak and vulnerable God makes himself be felt on her as loving protection. She feels always herself in his loving arms. The more the clutches of the Nazis tighten and close over her future, she says, I don't feel myself under anybody's clutches. I only feel myself in God's arms. End of quote. And if God stops helping me, she says, I will help God. This vulnerability of God, who nevertheless is the only one with whom she dialogues, and her only interlocutor in the middle of hell in which she lives, is the hinge pinion that maintains together the diverse ambiguities and paradoxes of her interrupted life. And that, however, was a vital center of burning love and force which poured from her as flames. At a certain moment, we are approaching the end. Already very close to the end of her life, on 22nd September 1942, Etty Hillesum expresses a desire, I quote, I would like very much to live as the lilies of the fields. If we understood well our times, it is this that it can teach us, to live like a lily of the fields, end of quote. Etty refers undoubtedly there to Matthew 6:28, when Jesus teaches the disciples the secret of the evangelical freedom, to be like the flowers growing in the fields. They never have to work or spin, but have more beauty than Solomon in all his glorious robes. Or to be like the birds in the sky. They do not sow or reap or gather into barns, yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Jesus' conclusion is logical. If God clothes the wild flowers growing in the field, which are here today and thrown into the furnace tomorrow, will he not much more look after the human being, his most beloved creature? Etty knows his secret, because God himself revealed it to her. It is enough to be, to allow to be, and to trust God's infinite goodness, who won't be able to respond to all our demands, but who fulfills in us his promises. The realization of those promises is verified in the fact that God accompanies and sustains humankind in the middle of tests and tribulations, so that darkness does not win light. Etty trusts this God, frail and powerless, who suffers with the victim instead of annihilating the executioner. She knows he is little capable of change a situation finally inseparable of this life. She consents in being each time more striped by this love of this God. And for that, she understands that she ought to give up everything, great words, grandiloquent attitudes. And I quote, it's necessary to become so simple and dumb as the wheat, which grows, or the rain that falls. It is necessary to be happy to be. End of quote. The big and dark eyes of Etty Hillesum closed in Auschwitz in November 1943, but her word and her testimony remain up to date. And they are one of the deepest readings ever made about this time of darkness and banality instaured by evil in action, the Nazi genocide in Europe. From Etty's pen on July 27, 1942, when already sure of the destiny that waited for her, she begins to pack her backpack to bring it to Westerbork. She writes this statement, and I quote, it will be very necessary that someone remains to pay attention, someone to testify later on that God also lived in our time. And why wouldn't be myself that witness? End of quote. Etty Hillesum's testimony resonates today, untouched and always more eloquent at the ears of our contemporary. Taught by the Spirit's freedom, she teaches always more to take care of God, discovered at the interior of each one, in order to be able to face difficulties presented by reality and take compassively on one's frail shoulders the pain of others in order to make it ours and help God to redeem it. Conclusion. The journey of Etty Hillesum from Eros to Adam. After reflecting on the biography and the writings of this extraordinary woman, there are some points we can bring in an attempt to an open conclusion. Since her youth, passionate and lived with a lot, even too much intensity, she encounters God. And this will recenter her life in a totally different way. But taking always as powerful referential her sexed body. With sovereign freedom, the Spirit will guide the body of this young woman passing through Eros paths, through a deep love for a man, till the supreme gift of the same body in communion with pain and death of a whole people, her people. Her writings are of great importance to demonstrate the agapic joy. The enjoyment of the soul is not incompatible with the pleasure of the body. On the contrary, Eros is figure and even way to what can be the relationship with God, and also to what indescribable flights can lead the human being. The Spirit who guides Etty Hillesum will demonstrate her freedom to blow wherever and whatever he and she wants to in these young Dutch Jews who lived in the middle of the 20th century. The Spirit realizes wonderful things and wants to surprise a world where sometimes the traces of God seem to be lost. Etty shows that the God by whom she's passionate is more alive than ever, and that he reveals himself in all his original and never repeated ways and forms. After starting with Pope Benedict, we can finish with Pope Francis. I quote, "The Church today doesn't have to begin the conversation or the pastoral approach with moral norms or dogmatic definitions. The center, the most important, is to announce Jesus has saved you and to facilitate a real encounter with God. The rest comes after." End of quote. The case of Etty Hillesum shows us that a true experience of loving encounter with God can change a life, even if it happens outside an institutionalized religion or in the most negative and hostile circumstances. Love is the only solution, even against the final solution. And this love can include, and even ought to include, the erotic element. But the goal always has to be the agapic synthesis, which shows that love is stronger than death and remains the only force that can change the world. Thank you very much.
We have time for a few questions. Would you like to take your own question?
Questions, comments?
Hi, I'm Paul Coleman, also the Theology Department with Peter. Thanks for coming and thanks for this talk. I just happened to be teaching a book yesterday in a doctoral seminar, Comparative Mysticism, by Jeff Kripal. Complicated book about. And Kripal's book talks about the extent to which, in different ways, mystical language is so often erotic. And I'm interested in the ways her language of kneeling before God took on erotic overtones, if it did.
Mm-hmm.
On the one hand, you did liken it, but you said that for her, kneeling was more intimate than sex.
Yeah.
But I'm intrigued by the extent to which she thought about that embodied gesture as erotic. or if not?
I think her mystic experience, first, is like a creatio ex nihilo. There was nothing. And then there is everything there. So it's grace, pure grace, etc. But grace supposes nature. Her nature was, as I tried to say here, very aware of the body. So her experience of God had to pass by her body. Had to pass by her body, but couldn't be in the same way as the relationship she had with other men and with Spear, she loved so much. So I think the fact of having this compulsion to kneel down is that God was taking possession of her, and that the sign of that was something in the body. To change position, to adopt one position, a corporate position. It was not like in other mystics we see a vision, the vision of the feeling of going, elevate, etc. Well, we can think of other cases, Teresa of Avila
Or
also.
warmth in the middle of your body.
Pregnancy, the warmth in the middle of the body. So I think for such a sensual woman as she was, the experience of God supposed that important place that the erotic and the corporeity had in her life. I would say that. I quote Teresa of Avila. Teresa of Avila has passages that, well, are absolutely erotic. Also. And she was a nun. Etty Hillesum is not a nun, not at all.